The rise of the Cold War fell hard on Black radicals like Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois and Claudia Jones. But it also provided a fabulous opportunity for more moderate and cautious reformers. If challenges to the American way of life, its social, economic, and political institutions could no longer be directly challenged in the Cold War climate, the thinking went by these moderates, the equation could be flipped around to the benefit of civil rights activism. Civil rights activism could be presented as an essential bulwark of the American way of life. Black liberals argued that America's greatest domestic vulnerability in the global Cold War against communism was its embarrassing record of race relations. And indeed, the Soviets made much of America's hypocrisy on race relations in their propaganda. By dismantling Jim Crow, the argument went, the United States would align its practice with its rhetoric, and by demonstrating its ability to peacefully elevate its darker citizens to full citizenship, illustrate the superiority of its democratic institutions in its battle for hearts and minds abroad. It would, in other words, turn its greatest existing propaganda weakness into a tremendous propaganda strength. It was hard, they argued, to save the Third World for democracy if democracy meant white supremacy. President Truman and the State Department also embraced this emerging consensus. In December 1946, Truman established his Committee on Civil Rights, which published To Secure These Rights in 1947, formally announcing the administration's opposition to segregation. The report produced the most substantial civil rights victory of the post-Reconstruction era. In 1948, Truman ordered the desegregation of the armed forces and the desegregation of the federal workforce. At the same time, the Justice Department began stressing to the Supreme Court that in the challenges to Jim Crow being brought before them by the NAACP, decisions in favor of segregation would have a negative impact abroad. Indeed, it is hard to view Brown v. Board of Education removed from this national security context. The ruling in Brown affirmed the basic fairness of the American Constitution before the world. It cast racism outside the purview of the federal government and cast the federal government as the solution to the lingering problems of racial inequality, not the problem itself. It is not inconsequential that the Justice Department was being pressured by the State Department to rule in ways that would make the United States look good in the context of the Cold War. To buffet America's image abroad, the State Department also sponsored a series of foreign trips by Black athletes, artists, musicians, and intellectuals. Between 1951 and 1955, the Harlem Globetrotters, for example, traveled to Berlin, Indonesia, Burma, and Italy. A series of so-called Jam-bassadors, Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, toured Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. The strategy with these Black goodwill ambassadors was not to deny the existence of racial inequality in the United States, but to emphasize the progress that had been made and to illustrate the heights of celebrity Blacks could rise to in the free world with the proper amount of talent and motivation. So what's happening here? Well, the political and economic foundation of Jim Crow is weakening. Opposition to Jim Crow is growing among white elites for reasons that are not rooted in moral concern, but rather in self-interest. These conditions generate opportunity, and the reason why Black communities seized on the opportunity was that they had been preparing for it all along. Let's look at some of the key participants. After she was arrested, Rosa Parks contacted E.D. Nixon from jail. Nixon was a railroad porter with a sixth-grade education, with a long career of activism. He'd organized the state branch of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the organization of A. Philip Randolph. During the Depression, Nixon organized farm workers and organized a committee to ensure that Alabama Blacks got their fair share of the benefits from federal programs. This work had made him an ally of Virginia and Clifford Durr, white Montgomery residents who were building their own legendary civil rights careers as members of the interracial Southern Conference for Human Welfare, and who provided important legal support for the Parks case. In the 1940s, Nixon organized the Montgomery Voters League and led a march of 750 people on the registrar's office. From 1939 to 1951, he had headed the Montgomery NAACP and served as state president of the organization from 1951 to 1953. The initial call for the boycott was made by Joanne Robinson, an English professor at Alabama State College and president of a local organization called the Women's Political Caucus, the WPC. The WPC, which was founded in 1946, had been organizing around the issue of segregated buses since the early 1950s and had brought more than a half dozen complaints about bus abuses before the city commission. They had threatened the mayor with a boycott in May 1954 if improvements weren't made. Then there was Rosa Parks herself. Parks recalled in 1994 that she did not get on the bus to get arrested, but to get home. But she was not the reluctant victim that she was portrayed as by the MIA or by King. And a strong case can be made that if she wasn't an agent provocateur on the night of December 1st, 1955, she knew exactly what she was doing when she refused to leave her seat. Parks, like Nixon and like Robinson, had been preparing for the Montgomery bus boycott for years with her political activism and with her training. Her grandfather had been a Garveyite. Her husband had founded the local NAACP and worked on the defense of the Scottsboro Boys. Parks had joined the NAACP in 1943, working in voter registration drives and registering to vote herself in 1945. She ran the local NAACP Youth Council and had worked with Nixon in the state organization and in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. During the war, she had attended one of Ella Baker's legendary leadership training conferences in Atlanta. In the summer of 1955, mere months before her arrest, Parks had been invited to attend a 10-day leadership workshop at Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, focusing on the fight for racial discrimination. Highlander, founded during the Depression by Miles Horton, who grew up in a poor white sharecropping family, has been described by sociologist Alden Morris as a movement halfway house for its role in providing leadership training to the ground troops of the civil rights movement. Attendees at Highlander included E.D. Nixon, Fred Shuttlesworth, who played the role in Birmingham that Nixon and Robinson and Parks played in Montgomery, SCLC leaders like Bernard Lee, Dorothy Cotton, Andy Young, and Hosea Williams, SNCC leaders like John Lewis, Bob Zellner, Diane Nash, and Marion Barry, and James Bevel, who played an important role first in SNCC and then in SCLC, King's organization. By the time Parks was arrested, she had a whole lot of experience, in other words, and a whole lot of leadership training. She had been engaged for years in intense discussions about the best means to unsettle Southern desegregation laws. Indeed, she had on several occasions before this refused to comply with bus segregation laws, to the point that some bus drivers, if they recognized her, refused to stop and pick her up. It was also no accident that Parks was the perfect test case for the Jim Crow law. Respectable, of unimpeachable character, tough, a model of moral righteousness, a perfect figurehead for a legal challenge. In March 1955, a 15-year-old Montgomery high school student named Claudette Colvin had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man. Joanne Robinson and the WPC suggested that Colvin's arrest would be a good test case. Colvin was an A student, and as Robinson described her, quote, quiet, well-mannered, neat, clean, unquote. But Colvin was also pregnant, and she had been charged with assault and battery on the police officer who had arrested her. She wasn't good enough in the eyes of Montgomery black leaders. Nixon believed that any subject for a test case must be spotless. 9 months later, Parks took her ride. She sat not at the back, but in the no man's land, on the shifting line dividing black and white riders that moved back and forth depending on the demographics of the crowd, and created an uncertainty that led to many of the disputes and much of the disobedience that arose on city buses and streetcars. It's worth noting that there was resistance to Jim Crow laws on streetcars and buses throughout the Jim Crow period. When Parks was asked to move, she refused, not with anger, but in soft language. She was not led away by police officers with resistance, but with compliance. There was motive, of course, for Parks to play the role of victim. Parks the seamstress was a more useful narrative than Parks the veteran activist. Indeed, King's portrayal of Parks as a victim of both the forces of history and the forces of destiny was a response to charges from members of the white community that she had been planted by the NAACP in order to challenge the law. The Montgomery bus boycott made King an international celebrity, but it was made possible by the preparations made by Nixon, Robinson, and Parks, and many others. Once it had begun, it was sustained for more than a year by an army of volunteers, the majority women, who organized carpools, raised funds, polled participants, endured bombings, and other acts of white violence. The Montgomery bus boycott told through the lens of King the Savior is far less useful for students of social change than this story of a Black community organizing for years, pushing relentlessly for change, and, when given the opportunity, breaking the door down.